and welcome to episode 93 of Prose. This week, empathize with, and sing about, a rather exhausted dragon, and get a lesson in how even the broken can be pieced back together. Both stories this week are by returning guest authors. The first dragon-based sung tale was a part of the Inktober Challenge, and the second hopeful story is one of our longer ones, and is uncharacteristically positive for prose. How about that, dear Patreon followers? You've been jonesing for some positivity, and here you go. Please go follow the show on social media under @ProsePodcast. If you are enjoying the show, please click the 5-star button on Apple Podcasts for Prose. It really helps out a lot. For easiest access to the show, subscribe using Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or whatever podcast app is your favorite. Lastly, and always not leastly, check the Prose Patreon page at patreon.com/Prose Podcast and consider supporting the show there. I will totally throw you tons of gratitude, as well as some cool swag. Thanks for listening. Let's get to the tale, shall we? This week, we have The Sleepy Dragon by Elizabeth Peterson and Brandon Nolan's The Trav'ler. Enjoy. The first story this week is something just a little bit different. In honor of the recently passed Inktober, one of our previous contributors wrote a flash fiction story in the form of a song. I will first read the text of the song and then play the song in its entirety. So, without any further ado, The Sleepy Dragon by Elizabeth Peterson. Safely the dragon nestles gently in the cave, tired of fighting with fire, wishing that she could pave a new way down the pathway towards the town she knows, wanting folks to stop running as she brings the treasure she owes. Curled up tighter, the dragon burrows in, sleeping off the worry that the town has put her in. They're relentlessly trying to hunt her, but the dragon sleeps. They say she hoards, but don't know what she keeps. Safely the dragon has her peace and quiet found, a haven for the tumult that the village brings around. The dragon sleeps.
Safely the dragon nestles gently in the cave, tired of fighting with fire, wishing that she could pave a new way down the pathway toward the town she knows, wanting folks to stop running as she brings the treasure she owes. Curled up tighter, the dragon burrows in, sleeping off the worry that the town has put her in. They're restlessly trying to hunt her, but the dragon sleeps. They say she hoards, but don't know what she keeps. Safely the dragon has her peace and quiet found, a haven for the tumult that the village brings around. The dragon sleeps.
Thank you for listening to The Sleepy Dragon by Elizabeth Peterson. Miss Peterson, as many of you know, has appeared on the show as a voice actor a couple times now. Miss Peterson is an educator, mathematician, and playwright who can be found between New England, Scotland, and Canada. She likes logic and words, and her favorite words are
syzygy, eleemosynary,
and
logodedele.
You can read her theater reviews and thoughts on the world at her website, mathematicalmedievalist.wordpress.com. Next up this week, we have a rather long and wonderful offering from returning guest author Brandon Nolan. Stick around for The Trav'ler. The Trav'ler by Brandon Nolan. There is a cold that billows east across the plains of the Midwest. It is a bitter cold, heralded by a fierce wind that howls across the flat open ground. It is oppressive and unrelenting, and no amount of clothing can shield from its piercing bite. It was that harsh cold that whipped around my shoulders and through my coats as I walked east on Highway 400 toward Wichita. It had been a while since I last traveled through this city. It seemed my wandering had been circling around it for some time, like an inward spiral toward the heart of the plains. It was mid-afternoon, but the overcast skies were already beginning to show signs of twilight. I could see the brink of darkness ahead of me as I made my way toward the outskirts of town. There, what used to be endless fields of wheat had slowly been turned into new residential developments. As the city grew, it pushed its residents out further from its center, and I found myself passing suburbs where before there had only been farmland. Up ahead, I noticed a car pulled off to the right side of the highway. It was an older sedan with faded blue paint and rust bubbling on the fender. I moved to the ditch to pass it by when I realized it was still occupied. I stopped, and I went around and knocked on the driver's window and smiled warmly. The driver was an older woman, maybe 50, with graying dark hair that was long overdue for another perm. She had tired green eyes, and the worry lines on her forehead spoke volumes. She slowly rolled down her window, just a crack. "Can I help you?" she said, with uncertainty edging her voice. "Actually, I would like to help you," I said. I motioned toward the front driver's side tire. "Do you have a spare?" She shook her head. "I just called for a tow. They'll have someone here in a bit." "I can probably have it switched for you before they even get here," I said. "Traffic is starting to pick up. It could still take them a while." She opened her mouth to reply, then closed it again. She looked me over, once up, once down. "You aren't dressed like someone just looking for a ride," she said. I chuckled. "Ma'am, I walk for a living. I'm not going to do it without a good set of clothes on my back. Now, what do you say? Let me help you out." She hesitated. I understood. It's a frightening thing being approached by some stranger on foot on the highway. Finally, though, she nodded. "It's all in the trunk." "Yes, ma'am," I said. I moved back to the trunk and waited for her to release the latch. She stepped out and followed me. "Car's falling apart," she muttered. She moved in front of me and opened the trunk with her keys. The trunk was nearly half full with a random assortment of things. Amidst the trash and a collection of old sports magazines and comic books were a few old golf clubs and a tennis racket, a couple old, beat-up romance novels, and a guitar case. The case appeared brand new, untouched even. It was a fine black leather-wrapped hard case with shining silver clasps. It had an inlaid silver plate on the front with the letters BDP finely engraved on it. She gingerly moved the case, and when she realized it needed to be removed to get the tire out, she looked pained. "I guess I'll just put it in the front seat," she said quietly. She carefully pulled the case out of the trunk and gently put it in the passenger seat, while I wrangled with pulling out the spare tire and tools. "You play?" I asked when she came back to the trunk. "No." Her mouth tightened in a line as she watched me carry the spare to the front of the car. She didn't say anything further, and I didn't press. "I'm sorry, I haven't introduced myself," I said. "I'm James." "Linda," she replied shortly. I began the slow process of lifting the car with the pitiful excuse for a jack that every car manufacturer puts in the back. I struggled with the jack handle that also doubled as the lug wrench and cursed at it under my breath every time the handle slipped. I finally got the flat tire off the ground and started on the lug nuts. "It's my son's," she said. "I'm sorry?" The lug wrench slipped and I scraped my right knuckles across the pavement. Several colorful profanities sat on the tip of my tongue, but I gritted my teeth and swallowed the words. I reset the wrench and looked back at her. "What's that?" "The guitar." "Ah." I turned back to the wrench and started wrestling with the lug nut. "It's a nice looking case. What kind of guitar?" "A Duesenberg Star Player." She said it with a proud, practiced tone. "That's good?" I asked. I finished pulling off the flat and carried it to the trunk. "I don't recognize the name." "One of the best," she replied. "Well then," I said, "I bet he's really good. How does it sound?" I lifted the spare and began spinning the lug nuts on to hold it in place. She didn't respond, so I looked back at her. I don't know," she whispered. I almost missed her response in the wind. Her eyes wandered the landscape, tracing it back toward the center of Wichita. She stared into the distance for a long moment before realizing I was still watching her. She gave me a small, nervous smile and nodded at the tire. "How's it coming?" "Almost done," I said. I turned back to the spare and tightened the lug nuts. Satisfied they were secure, I started lowering the car. The jack received a fair number of grumbled curses before I got it fully lowered and stowed the tools in the trunk and slammed the lid shut. "All set," I said. I started to wipe my hands on my jeans but looked at them and thought better of it. "I would shake your hand, ma'am, but I wouldn't want to get your hands dirty." I displayed my hands and she grinned. I smiled back. "Well," I said, "this should see you home safe at least. Looks like you'll be needing a new tire though." "Thank you," she said. She made no move to get back in the car, looking at me as if she were waiting for something. No problem. It's what I do, ma'am." I tightened my scarf and recited part of my favorite Irish blessing. "May the wind always be at your back." I started walking past her, back toward the center of town when she caught my coat. "Wait," she said. "How do I thank you?" I looked into her eyes. There was pain there. Some old, some new, all bubbling to the surface. "A cup of coffee?" I said. "And how about your story?" She drove me to her house. It was close, and she said she would rather make me coffee than buy me one. I didn't mind. Home-brewed coffee beats a mocha latte any day. Okay, sometimes it doesn't, but sometimes the personal touch is worth the difference. We pulled up to a small brick house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't run down by any means, but the house had seen its better days. The bushes had never been trimmed back for the winter. The paint on the shutters was flaking, and the yard had long ago given way to encroaching clover and weeds. We went in, and she pointed me to the bathroom down the hall where I could wash my hands. After cleaning up, I took a seat on the couch in the living room and looked around while she prepared the coffee. I could see the dining room table from my seat. It was sturdy and well used. Its glossy finish had long ago dulled and chipped from family dinners throughout the years. The furniture all felt similar, once nice but now older and worn. I took off my hat and leaned back. There was a feeling of heaviness in the house. I'd felt it when I first stepped in and couldn't shake it. There was something out of place. Then it hit me. There were no pictures. I looked at the walls and on the fireplace mantel, and they were empty. Everyone has pictures. Family, pets, vacations. Little manifestations, little physical trinkets of our memories, and she had none. "Cream or sugar?" she called from the kitchen. "Cream, if you have it," I replied, half shouting. A few moments later, she appeared with 2 steaming mugs. She handed me one and sat in the recliner across the room, watching me. I took a sip and burned my tongue. I concealed my discomfort with a cough. Linda, as I came to know her, sat there staring down into her cup. I waited patiently for her to talk. I didn't want to rush her. While watching her in silence, I realized then why there were no pictures. Something had happened, and those memories were still too sharp. Pictures just reminded her of a happier life she felt she no longer had. At first, she would ignore them, thinking that if she didn't look, she wouldn't have to remember. Then it got to be too much. It also explained why she let a stranger into her home. Loneliness is a terrible thing. It moves into your entire existence, waving a bleak flag in front of everything you do, reminding you that there is nobody there. Of course, she reached out to a stranger after that stranger showed her kindness. I met my husband in college. Her voice broke me from my thoughts. Sean was finishing a degree in business analytics and I was studying to be a nurse. Mutual friends set us up. He was funny and reckless and I fell madly in love with him. We dated for a year before marrying and soon after he moved us to Wichita for work in the air industry. It wasn't long after that I had our son Blake. Linda daubed her eyes with a paper napkin. Blake grew up fast and strong and we thrived here. Sean enjoyed working here and we met so many friends in our neighborhood. As Blake grew up, we soon discovered he was talented with music. Gifted. He played anything we put in front of him. Piano, violin, drums, but his favorite was the guitar. He saved up one summer and bought himself a decent acoustic and taught himself how to play. Blake would spend hours on that guitar every day and by the end of summer he had mastered it. The guitar was what he always played around the house. And oh, his father and I loved it. Linda told me of her family's joys and struggles. Blake was accepted into a prestigious school in New York, but he moved back unexpectedly after less than a year with a young wife and a child on the way. He got a job doing repairs at a local music store, and he joined a local band. After the baby arrived, he began to grow distant from everyone. He lashed out at his family and friends when they tried to break through his dark moods. Linda cleared her throat and looked at me. There were tears there in her eyes, threatening to fall. Blake got so bad he stopped working. He lost his temper. Christine, she took their little girl and left to go stay with her parents in Montana. Blake was going to move back here, but his father... She lowered her head. They had a fight here last Christmas. Sean gave Blake an ultimatum about his behavior and Blake got angry. They both got so loud and Blake just left. I never saw him so mad before. A single tear rolled down Linda's cheek. After the fight, Sean said he didn't feel well. He went downstairs to watch TV and I let him be. I checked on him before I went to bed and he... She cleared her throat again. They told me he had a heart attack. He was gone almost instantly. Blake never came back home. He wasn't at the funeral. I haven't seen or heard from him since. Linda sat huddled on the recliner staring at her coffee mug. The room had darkened considerably, but I sat there waiting on her to collect her thoughts. So often people want to say something in this situation. Your brain tries to chase out the silence with a bit of wisdom or compassion, but those kinds of words never quite ring true. They're filler, no matter how sincere. Sometimes, it's better to endure the quiet. Finally, Linda stood. I'm sorry, James, she said. I've taken up too much of your time. Not at all, I replied. I asked for your story. I expected it to take as long as you needed. I stood and held out my hand. Thank you. When her hand touched mine, I gave what reassurance I could. Peace, mostly, and a small sprig of hope. It was then that the dam behind her moist eyes finally broke. I stood silently while all her pain and sadness washed down her face. Her body heaved with sobs and she buried her head in her hands. I stayed in front of her, afraid to move away, hesitant to step closer. She lifted her head after several minutes and her red-rimmed eyes investigated mine. Her voice was soft but firm with conviction. "Are you an angel?" she whispered. "Do you know the story of Horatio Spofford?" I asked. She shook her head slightly. "No." "He was a real estate investor in Chicago, late 19th century, I said. "He lost most of his business in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. That same year, his 4-year-old son died from scarlet fever. 2 years later, he sent his wife and 4 daughters ahead of him to England for a vacation. The ship they took was struck by another, and only his wife survived. This man lost his business, his children, nearly everything. Yet, when Horatio left for England to meet his wife, and as his ship sailed over the spot where his daughters died, he wrote, 'When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul.'" Linda stared at me a moment, mouthing the lyrics silently. "I remember singing that hymn as a child," she said. "It has aged well," I replied. "You need peace, Linda. What little I have, I can at least offer that." She looked away and stared past me at the empty living room wall. "Thank you," she managed. I smiled back at her and picked my hat off the couch. "Have hope, Linda," I said. I put my hat back on and tightened my scarf and walked back into the cold. I stopped at the end of the sidewalk and glanced back at the house. The shades were still drawn at the front window, but the porch light winked on and chased away the shadows in the lawn. I nodded and turned east, toward the heart of the city, with the cold, angry wind at my back. The streetlights cast a yellow glow onto the streets as I closed on the heart of Wichita. I met the road that runs alongside the Arkansas River and followed its winding path into the center of the city. On the north bank, just before the taller buildings start, is a large rust-red statue of a Native American. Called the Keeper of the Plains, he has stood sentinel on the river for decades. Before he came into view, I could see the glow from the fires that are lit at his feet every night. I stopped and watched him for a long time before moving on. The fire lit him like a great beacon, and he stood stoic, vigilant. Half an hour later, I found myself in the heart of downtown. The daytime businesses that took residence in the looming towers were mostly dark, but in between all the towers of stone and dark glass lies a lively brick-paved block called Old Town. The bright lights and signs of Old Town chased away most of the pressing downtown darkness, and the sound of people drew me to it. I stood outside the pool of lights and watched for some time as people came in and out of the upscale restaurants and lively bars, the wind carrying away their excited conversations. Then I heard the music. A gentle melody pulled at me. It was warm against the bitter cold, and it beckoned me into Mead's Corner, a homely pub on the edge of the square. I find it hard to believe in coincidence anymore. Too many times my wandering has led me right to where I'm needed most. Call it fate or a miracle or some sort of divine working. Whatever it is, I know it when I see it. And I knew without a doubt that that young man playing guitar on that small platform in Mead's Corner was Linda's son. He barely spared me a glance as I walked in, shedding my coat and scarf and stomping the snow from my boots. I made my way to the bar, ordered a beer, and turned to watch him. A battered guitar case lay in front of his stool, open for tips. His dark hair curled out from the edges of a worn green stocking cap, and his jeans and flannel shirt both had seen better days. He played an old acoustic. It looked like desperation alone held it together. But when his fingers touched the strings, pure gold notes emanated. Some men practiced their whole lives in pursuit of those notes. It was plain that to Blake they came as easy as breathing. He had a gift. The entire pub was enraptured by the sound. When Blake played, conversations died off. Even the bartender stopped filling glasses while music was in the air. He played Billy Joel and Garth Brooks, the Beatles and One Republic. His voice was silky smooth, but it had a raw edge to it. like it would cut you if you stayed too long appreciating its beauty. I listened for almost an hour before I moved. Blake stepped down from his stool and came to the bar to refill a glass of water, and conversation sprang to life around the room to fill the silence. As Blake walked back to his stool with water in hand, I followed. I touched his shoulder. "Do you take requests?" I asked. "Depends," he said. "If I know it, and it's not a stupid song, sure." "Do you know Ozzy's Mama, I'm Coming Home?" He stared into my eyes for a long time, not blinking. Finally, he turned away from me and climbed on his stool, placing the water next to him and hefting his guitar. "Fine, I can play it." "It's just that it's one of my favorites," I said. Blake waved his hands toward me, dismissing me. "I said I would, okay, just I'll play it in a bit." "Thanks," I said. "Yeah, okay." I walked back to the bar and sat back down. Blake played a few more songs. Between each one, he took a long drink of water, his eyes boring into me over the rim of his glass. Finally, he played. "Times have changed and times are strange. Here I come, but I ain't the same. Mama, I'm coming home." He sang it completely and beautifully. As he sang the last line, his voice cracked and his fingers hit a sour chord. The song shattered into pieces. Abruptly, he bent over and scooped the cash up from his guitar case and crammed it into his pocket. After securing his guitar in its case, he walked to the far end of the bar. Over the slowly rising din of now disenchanted patrons, I heard snippets of his conversation with the bartender. "Supposed to play another 2 hours. Just can't tonight. Guy over there, he say something? May get up to you next week. Only playing half then." The bartender opened the register and handed a small stack of cash over to Blake, and Blake took it and walked briskly for the exit, his haunted gaze avoiding my eyes as he hurried past me. I sat for a full minute, tapping my fingers on the bar and lost in thought. After a few more moments, I sighed and finished my beer, now room temperature, and tossed a tin onto the bar next to my glass. I put on my coat and wrapped my scarf tight, then pushed myself out the door and into the cold. The door closed behind me and left me with nothing but the sound of the wind shoving snow against buildings and parked cars. The old town square was no longer bustling. Most folks were long gone or tucked into a few bars scattered about. Lamplight reflected swirling snow, each light down the street its own life-size, yellowed, gloomy snow globe. I turned west again, back toward the river I crossed after leaving Linda's house, and began walking with Ernest. I saw Blake when I reached the edge of the bridge. His guitar case was leaned against the railing and he stood on the outside edge of it, hands grasping the rails as he leaned out over the icy water. I moved slowly, careful not to startle him. I got close to just outside of arm's reach when he noticed me. His eyes flashed with anger and he screamed, "What the hell do you want, old man?" "Blake," I said, "let's calm..." "How the fuck do you know who I am?" Blake inched further away, still precarious on the edge of the bridge. "Who the fuck are you?" I lifted both my hands, hoping to placate him. "My name is James, Blake. I met your mother today, and I don't think it's a coincidence that I ran into you tonight. Why don't you come back to this side and we can talk?" Blake stared out over the black water. He was shaking. It took me a moment to realize he was laughing quietly. "You've got to be shitting me." "Your soul has been heavy for so long, Blake," I whispered just barely above the wind. "Your wife, your little girl, your father. But even before that, you've been at war with yourself for so long you forgot what peace feels like." Blake looked back at me, fire in his eyes. "What would you know?" he replied in a low voice. "My life is poison. I infect everyone else around me with disaster." "Blake," I said, "there is still hope." "Hope?" Blake growled. "Look at where we are, old man. Hope has disappointed me every step of my life." He nodded toward the water. "This is where hope finds some miserable sod to torture." "Do you know the story of Horatio Spofford?" I asked. "He's the real estate investor from..." "Fuck you," Blake interrupted. "Don't try to sell me that it is well bullshit." "He found peace, Blake," I said, trying to keep my voice level. I was losing him. "Are you really trying to sell me some angel bullshit?" he asked. He barked out a laugh. "Huh, do you get your fucking wings if you save me? Is that what this is?" "I'm not..." I shook my head. "That's not what this is about, Blake." "Then what is it?" Blake slipped as he tried moving further away. His feet left the bridge and one hand swung wide as he tried to catch the rail. He cried out as his body slammed into the railing. I ran forward and leaned out, grabbing a fistful of his shirt collar and pulled him up. His body went limp as I lifted, and I nearly lost him. With a grunt, I pulled him over the railing and dropped him next to his guitar case. I stood back to catch my breath and slipped on a patch of ice, landing on my hands and knees. I looked up at a sound and saw Blake curled into a ball on the ground, sobbing. I crawled over to him and sat my back against the railing. I examined my scraped palms while his body shuddered with heavy sobs. After some time, his cries quieted into soft occasional whimpers. "I'm not here to save you, Blake," I said quietly. "I'm just making sure you get a second chance. You deserve one, man. For your sake, for your family, for your mom." "I can't go back." "Have you ever tried?" Blake sat up and leaned on the railing next to me. He wiped his eyes and nose on his sleeves and stared into the night. "You talked to Mom?" "Yeah." "How is she?" "Hurting, Blake," I said. "She lost her granddaughter and then she lost you and your father on the same night. She's been alone for almost a year. That house feels..." I shook my head. "She needs her son back." "I don't think I'm ready," Blake whispered. "Soon then," I said. "Christmas is next week. You should be there." Blake sniffled. "I need to think about this." I eyed him. "I'm not going to jump again. It's okay. I think I'll be okay." "Do you have a place to stay, man?" "Yeah." I watched him for a long moment before getting to my feet. I watched him for another minute or two and then turned away and began walking back toward downtown. I looked back only once to check, and he hadn't moved. Part of me didn't trust him, but I felt strangely at peace with my decision. I walked on and left him there alone with his pain. It didn't take me long to find Blake the next morning. I had spent the early hours considering my next destination and had bought him something while I made my plans. He was sitting on a bench in front of an antique store window. He sat playing, his guitar case open in front of him for tips. When I walked up, he was playing Stains' It's Been a While. I tossed a few 20s into his case. Clipped to the cash was a bus ticket that would take him west and drop him close to home. He stopped playing to glance at the gift and looked up at me, curious. "Buy her something for Christmas, man," I said. "Maybe dinner with her son or something." "I'm not ready." "Doesn't have to be today, Blake," I said. "But maybe tomorrow." He nodded and began fiddling with a tuning peg. "Thanks, old man." "We all break. Doesn't mean we have to stay broken." I turned to walk away. "You never actually said you weren't an angel." I looked back at Blake, smiled and shrugged. "I never got my fucking wings for saving you." Blake snorted, and I left. As I walked away, he played and sang. "I've seen your face 1,000 times. Every day we've been apart. And I don't care about the sunshine, yeah. 'Cause Mama, I'm coming home." Thank you for listening to The Trav'ler, an original short story by Brandon Nolan. Brandon Nolan lives in Northwest Arkansas with his wife and 2 boys and a daughter on the way. When he is not doing his best Toby Flinderson impression for his day job, he is spending time with his family and playing video games, and scratching out a pretty bang-up fantasy story or two when he can. All sounds you hear come from YouTube's original audio library and freesound.org. All of these are being used under CC 01.0 Universal Public Domain Dedication licenses. That does it this week for Prose. Please do consider sharing the podcast with someone that you think might enjoy it. And do continue about your day. While you continue about your day, remember to love those around you. Tell them that you do and embrace this life as it is always stranger than fiction. Reach out to that person you haven't reached out to in some time in the spirit of our final story. It means a lot. See you next time, and thanks for listening.